The morning Ozzy Osbourne left this world, something broke. And it wasn't just news. It was the kind of break you feel in your ribs, in your breath, in the places words never reach. Millions felt it, like a sudden vacuum in the chest, a collapse of something they didn't know was holding them up. He wasn't just a sound. He was shelter. He was the voice that rose louder than our sorrow, the darkness that strangely comforted us when our own got too loud. At 76, he didn't go out with applause. He vanished into a silence so brutal it made grown men cry in empty parking lots. And that silence, still echoing, still cold, is the loudest thing he's ever left behind. The world mourns a legend, but for so many, it feels like mourning a brother, a father, a wounded friend who somehow understood your pain before you even spoke it. And yet, no grief compares to hers. Because Sharon isn't mourning the icon. She's mourning the man whose slippers still sit by the bed, the man whose toothbrush hasn't been thrown away, the man whose laugh once filled the hallways at 3 a.m., even when the world outside was crumbling. She was more than a wife. She was the battlefield nurse, the last light, the one who stitched him together when the world tore him apart. Now she walks through their home like it's a ghost town. The couch remembers. The chairs wait. The bed has too much space. Her grief isn't poetic. It's surgical. It slices. It drains. It feels like someone reached inside her chest and took the heart without asking, and left her awake to feel the emptiness. There is no script for this kind of mourning. Only the haunting sound of what's gone and the cruel ringing of everything that remains. So before we take one more step into this story, let us pause. Let us lift a hand, not just in respect, but in shared mourning. For the Prince of Darkness and for the woman left behind, now navigating a silence that no stage light can soften. In the aftermath of Ozzy Osbourne's passing, as the world staggered under the weight of losing a global icon, one woman's grief rose like a siren above the mourning crowd. The grief of Sharon Osbourne. No tribute, no candlelit vigil, no headline could echo the sound of her sorrow. She wasn't just Ozzy's wife. She was his shadow and his flame, his fiercest protector, his battlefield partner, and the only mirror that ever reflected him truthfully. Their love story was not rehearsed, not perfect, but it was brutally honest, fiercely loyal, and drenched in survival. And now, with her other half torn away, Sharon stands alone in a storm of unbearable heartbreak and a solemn vow she refuses to break. For over 40 years, she wasn't just beside Ozzy. She was the shield between him and destruction. When the world laughed at him, she listened. When addiction stole his clarity, she fought for his soul. When disease ravaged his body, she stayed up through hospital nights, watching every breath. She lifted him through detox, hid him from ruthless cameras, held his body steady when his spirit wanted to soar, but his bones gave way. Sharon knew Ozzy in ways no biography ever could. And now, as millions say goodbye to the legend, it is Sharon who shoulders the duty of keeping the truth alive. In the private aftermath, Sharon has barely spoken. Only once has she whispered to the world, "He was surrounded by love." But those who've seen her in the days since describe a woman moving like glass, shattered, yet somehow still catching light. At the funeral, dressed in black, Sharon walked in silence, flanked by her children. Her face bore the kind of grief that can't be rehearsed. A face swollen from tears, her hands trembling as she clutched a single white rose, the symbol of what was taken. When the choir fell silent and Ozzy's music filled the chapel, Sharon's knees buckled, caught only by Jack, as she let out a sound, not quite a sob, not quite a scream, but the sound of a soul breaking in real time. Friends say she has barely eaten. She drifts from room to room in their home, touching his jackets, rewatching old clips, placing her forehead to the pillow he last laid on. And yet, even in this bottomless grief, she moves with purpose. Because Sharon is not just mourning. She is executing the promise she made in the hush of midnight. In those raw, whispered moments, when Ozzy feared becoming a myth instead of a man, she vowed to tell the truth. She vowed to protect what was real. And she has begun. The first step is monumental. There are reports that Sharon is orchestrating a memorial celebration unlike any the world has seen. Wembley Stadium will host a tribute concert later this year. Not a polished pageant, but a roar of guitars, of rawness, of soul. The very musicians Ozzy loved, lifted, and mentored will take the stage. No eulogies, only energy. Because that's how Ozzy lived. That's how he'd want to be remembered. But Sharon's vision doesn't end with one night. There are also indications that she has laid the foundation for something far more enduring. The Ozzy Osbourne Legacy Foundation. It will champion 3 causes that became Ozzy's final mission: mental health awareness, addiction recovery, and music education for underprivileged youth. These were not just passions. They were the scars Ozzy bore with pride. And through this foundation, Sharon ensures those scars become roadmaps for others lost in the dark. Quietly, she's also returned to a long-shelved manuscript, her memoir. But this book is not a tell-all. It is a love letter to Ozzy's final decade, his battles, his softness, his humanity. Sharon has kept journals for years, filled with medication lists, late-night fears, and whispered words Ozzy thought no one would hear. One entry simply reads, "If I can't sing, I'll scream. If I can't scream, I'll whisper. But I won't leave in silence." That's the Ozzy she knew, and that's the Ozzy she will show the world. Alongside the memoir, a documentary is underway. Sharon has opened the vault. Home videos, voice notes, unseen interviews. Audiences will see not just a rock star, but a man. Barefoot in the kitchen, giggling with Kelly, planting a kiss on Sharon's head after an argument. This isn't the Prince of Darkness. This is the man who loved, who stumbled, who fought, who healed, and who always came home. Grief has not broken Sharon. It has forged her resolve. She will carve legacy from chaos. She will honor not just the icon, but the man behind the myth. Because her tears aren't weakness, they're fuel. "He didn't want a statue," she once said. "He wanted someone to tell the damn truth." And that's what she will do. Ozzy wasn't perfect. He was a beautiful wreckage, a warrior on fire. And Sharon loved every fierce, flawed inch of him. Now, as she signs contracts, approves footage, and maps out every note of his legacy, she is not saying goodbye. She is giving him back to us, piece by imperfect piece. And long after the lights of the tribute concert go dim, long after the final chapter of the memoir is read, Sharon will still be there, somewhere in black, still holding that unbearable silence. But in her hands, that silence becomes a song the world will never stop singing. Swallowing the grief, holding back the tears just for a moment, we now invite you to travel back in time, to the quiet streets of Aston, Birmingham, where a boy named John Michael Osbourne grew up with more shadows than dreams, and where the legend of Ozzy truly began. Before the roaring crowds, before the blazing lights, before the legend of the Prince of Darkness was etched into music history, there was only silence. A silence so heavy, it threatened to crush the soul of a boy who didn't grow up to dream. He grew up to survive. In the soot-stained slums of Aston, Birmingham, a young John Michael Osbourne, born in 1948, lived in a cramped, cold home with 6 children and 2 parents who were too exhausted to nurture. His father, worn thin by factory labor, believed emotion was weakness. His mother, hardened by endless hours on the assembly line, rarely had the energy to offer softness. Ozzy, as the world would later know him, was not the clever one, not the charming one. He was the overlooked one, the child who blended into the wallpaper of poverty. At school, he found no refuge. The letters taunted him. Numbers blurred and danced. Dyslexia wasn't understood in the 1950s. It was mistaken for lack of intelligence. Teachers dismissed him as hopeless, and classmates mocked him with cruel delight. The bullying wasn't just words across playgrounds. It was daily exclusion, shoves in the hallway, and silent bruises behind buildings. And no adult ever asked why. At home, there was no escape. Once, after coming home in tears, his father responded with severe discipline. Not because he was weak, but because weakness wasn't tolerated. Pain didn't get you sympathy, Ozzy would later recall. It got you punishment. And so, the silence around him grew louder. He learned to wear it like armor. But armor doesn't heal. By the time he turned 14 in 1962, that silence had become unbearable. In a tiny, dimly lit bedroom, overwhelmed by despair, he stood on a chair, feeling like there was no path forward. Fate intervened, not with mercy, but with fury. His father burst in and pulled him down, then lashed out again, as though harshness could silence hopelessness. Something in him cracked that day. Or maybe something finally hardened. He stopped trying at school, stopped speaking unless required. He drifted through adolescence with the blank stare of someone already halfway gone. The sound of laughter became foreign. The mirror showed a boy already fading. At 15, he dropped out with no qualifications, no purpose, and no plan. He worked where he could, at a slaughterhouse, on construction sites, in factories tuning car horns. But he was too distracted, too awkward, too broken for any of it to last. Each job ended the same: dismissed, forgotten, alone. By 17, hunger gnawed at him. Not metaphorical, but real, physical hunger. His shoes had holes, his shirts hung in threads, and his hope was a crumpled thing he no longer bothered to hold. He was running out of oxygen, not just in his lungs, but in his life. When desperation hit, it didn't whisper. It screamed. In 1965, a failed attempt at burglary led to time in Winson Green Prison. Behind those walls, reality hit like iron. In one frightening encounter, he was threatened by another inmate and defended himself the only way he could, with what was nearby. It wasn't bravery, it was survival. But even in that darkness, a spark refused to die. One afternoon, the Beatles' "She Loves You" crackled through a prison radio, and something ignited. For the first time, Ozzy didn't want to disappear. He wanted to be seen, to be heard, to live out loud. "That moment changed me," he would later say. "I didn't know how to play anything, but I knew I needed to be on stage. I needed to scream louder than the pain inside me." That scream became his salvation. Not success, not yet, but a reason to keep going. In that moment, in that prison, the boy who had once begged the world to let him go made a vow. He would not pass away forgotten in Birmingham. He would be loud. He would be relentless. He would be unforgettable. And from that decision, a legend began to rise, not from peace or privilege, but from the ashes of despair, where pain forged a voice that would one day shake the world. The shadows of his broken youth had barely begun to lift when something extraordinary pierced the void. A sound, a calling that would become his compass through decades of chaos. Released from Winson Green Prison in 1965 at just 17, Ozzy Osbourne wasn't searching for redemption. He wasn't seeking purpose. He was merely drifting through a world that had already labeled him unworthy, invisible, expendable. His 6-week sentence for an attempted clothing shop theft, a desperate move driven more by hunger than malice, had not rehabilitated him. It had simply confirmed what he already feared, that he didn't matter. He stepped out of that cell more fractured than before, carrying bruises not only on his skin, but deeper, in the quietest parts of himself. And then, without warning, came a sound, not a sermon, not a savior, but a song. The Beatles' "She Loves You" fizzled through a cheap radio speaker, and it was as if the sky cracked open. It was like God spoke through music, he would say later, his voice trembling with memory. That moment didn't erase the loneliness or the shame, but it planted something fragile in him, a vision. He didn't know how to get there, but suddenly he knew where he had to be, inside the noise. Not polished music, not perfect music, but raw, guttural sound. Sound that could scream louder than the silence he'd carried since childhood. Louder than the fear. Louder than the despair that once pulled him to the brink. Just 2 years before, in the same dim bedroom, he had stood on a chair, lost in the darkest fog a teenager could face. Unsure if he'd see another morning. Now, he had something to hold. And by 1968, that scream had found its echo. A newspaper ad led him to a crumbling rehearsal room in Birmingham, where he met 3 other haunted souls. Tony Iommi, a guitarist whose missing fingertips had only sharpened his fire. Geezer Butler, a bassist whose fascination with the mysterious bled into every note. And Bill Ward, a drummer who played like he was channeling thunder from the heavens. They called themselves Earth. But it wasn't until they saw a marquee for an old horror film, Black Sabbath, that everything clicked. If people pay to be scared, Ozzy later said, why not give them music that terrifies and transforms? They weren't chasing stardom. They were exorcising demons. Their songs weren't entertainment. They were therapy. They were fury set to distortion. Grief wrapped in guitar strings. On Friday, February 13th, 1970, they released their debut album, self-titled and shrouded in omen. Critics recoiled. They labeled it noise, even evil. But the outcasts, the wounded, the unseen, they heard something else. They heard themselves. Ozzy didn't just sing to them, he shouted their pain. Later that same year, the band rushed through their second record, almost by accident. But Paranoid became sacred text. War Pigs, Iron Man, and the haunting title track weren't songs, they were anthems for the alienated. Ozzy's voice, rough and untamed, wasn't trained, but it was authentic. It was the cry of someone who had once begged for silence and now roared in defiance. I didn't know what I was doing, he confessed, but I knew it had to be loud. And it was. Loud enough to be heard by those still trapped in their own quiet wars. He couldn't read music, had never taken a single lesson. But he didn't need to. His pain was the melody. His childhood was the rhythm. His trauma was the beat. And his soul? That was the amplifier. Behind the wild antics, the showmanship, the gothic flair, lived the same boy from Aston. The boy told he was dumb, worthless, forgettable. That boy hadn't gone away. He had just found a microphone. The early years of Black Sabbath weren't just the birth of heavy metal. They were the birth of reclamation. Ozzy didn't invent the genre. He bled it into being. Every growl, every shriek, every note was defiance against poverty, shame, invisibility. Fame arrived fast, sold-out crowds, gold records, magazine covers, but inside, he was still unraveling. No amount of noise could mute the echo of his past. As the 1970s rolled on, albums like Master of Reality and Sabbath Bloody Sabbath cemented their legacy. But Ozzy was slipping. Missed rehearsals turned into missed connections. His spark dimmed, and the rift between him and Tony Iommi grew colder by the day. Once brothers in sound, now separated by resentment. Then, in 1979, came the blow he never expected. They let him go, not to his face, but through someone else. Ozzy later said, with visible pain, "They didn't even tell me themselves. That was my band." It wasn't just a firing. It was an exile. Sabbath had been his sanctuary. The one place where noise made sense, where pain turned into purpose. Now, it was gone. He vanished into a dark hotel room in Los Angeles, curtains drawn, spirit dimmed. "I just sat there," he remembered. "Days passed. I didn't eat. I didn't feel. I thought maybe that was it." The world still called him Ozzy Osbourne. But inside, he felt like a ghost clinging to echoes, a soul searching for the scream that had once saved him. Legends don't disappear. They evolve. And in Ozzy Osbourne's darkest descent, something quietly sparked in the ruins of his despair. Sharon Osbourne, daughter of Sabbath's former manager, didn't see a washed-up singer. She saw a man with music still clawing inside him. She found him in fragments, buried under addiction and abandonment, and told him something no one else dared to believe. "You were the soul of that band. You can rise without them." Her conviction wasn't loud. It was lightning in a whisper. Then came Randy Rhoads, brilliant, disciplined, and ethereal. His guitar didn't just speak. It wept. It soared. It tore open silence. To Ozzy, Randy wasn't just a guitarist. He was oxygen. Together, they didn't chase fame. They rebuilt survival, track by track. The result was Blizzard of Oz in 1980. It wasn't a debut. It was a defibrillator. Songs like Crazy Train weren't entertainment. They were proof of life. Every note screamed, "I'm still here. I still matter." Looking back, Ozzy didn't just recover. He was reforged. His breakdown wasn't destruction. It was purification. And though the road ahead would carry sorrow, loss, and scars that no spotlight could conceal, this was the chapter where his voice roared from the pit louder than ever. Ozzy once said, "I was spiraling. But something in me kept going. I always kept going." His bond with Randy was beyond collaboration. It was salvation. Randy didn't enter with chords. He arrived like a beam through storm clouds. For Ozzy, still reeling from being cast aside and battling unseen wars, Randy proved that brilliance and kindness could coexist. His youth wasn't chaos. It was clarity. His creativity didn't explode. It flowed like a sacred river. Together, they made more than albums. They made catharsis. When Diary of a Madman released in 1981, it was a declaration of rebirth. Ozzy, once written off, now stood defiant, and Randy was the sculptor of that resurrection. Ozzy said, "Randy wasn't just a bandmate. He was family. The reason I didn't give up." On stage, they were fire and form, Ozzy wild and raw, Randy controlled and divine. Off stage, they were kindred, equal parts mischief and depth. Ozzy saw not just talent, but soul. He had a kind of grace, he remembered, like he knew time was short, and he made every note eternal. Their urgency was unspoken, as if both knew miracles don't linger. But no miracle stays untouched. And just beyond the horizon, fate was sharpening its blade. On March 19, 1982, that blade fell. During a tour stop in Leesburg, Florida, a brief morning detour turned tragic. A small aircraft, meant only for a harmless ride, became the instrument of unimaginable loss. Randy boarded, along with a crew member. The plane circled once, twice, and then impact. A wing clipped their tour bus. The plane spun, fell, and ignited in a brutal explosion. Randy Rhoads was gone, only 25, a brilliant flame swallowed by daylight. Ozzy, standing below, watched it happen. He ran, screaming Randy's name, falling to his knees at the wreckage, unable to comprehend the silence. For hours, he sobbed. For days, he didn't speak. For weeks, he disappeared inside a grief so paralyzing it became airless. It wasn't just Randy who died, Ozzy later shared. My hope died. My reason for trying died. Even Sharon couldn't reach him at first. The tour halted. The music stopped. Their home sank into stillness. Randy's death didn't just wound Ozzy. It carved something out of him. For a long time, nothing filled it. But slowly, painfully, he began to write. Not to heal, but to remember. Every lyric became a candle. Every performance, a prayer. He didn't return to music for fame or even for fans. He returned for Randy. Every stage he stepped on after carried the weight of a spirit lost too soon. He was still broken, but moving. And for Ozzy, that meant he was still alive. You'd think the worst was over, that surviving the unspeakable would somehow teach the soul to mend. But grief is no obedient guest. And for Ozzy Osbourne, the years after Randy Rhoads' tragic loss weren't a path to healing. They were a slow, spiraling fall into silence. A silence so loud, it swallowed even the music that once saved him. The 1980s passed in a storm of noise, blurred by exhaustion and sorrow. Every tour became a battlefield. Every hotel room a cracked reflection of the man he used to be. On stage, he played the madman, painted eyes, wild energy, legend in motion. But behind the scenes, he was vanishing, volatile, number lost. Sharon, who had once pulled him from the ashes, stood by, unshaken in her love. But even she could not always break through the fog he wore like skin. I wasn't even in my own life, Ozzy later confessed. I was just gone. By 1987, alcohol had taken him completely. Pills blurred the lines between memory and dream, between night and numb escape. Then came August 1989. A night not marked by rage, but by collapse. A night when the man who had lost everything nearly destroyed the only thing left, Sharon. In a haze too dense to recall, Ozzy did something he would never forgive himself for. It wasn't me, he later whispered. It felt like I was watching a stranger. And when I woke up, when I realized, I shattered. He was taken away that night, confused, blank-eyed, hollowed by his own actions. Sharon, devastated yet composed, later said, I didn't know whether to call the police or an ambulance. I just knew. This couldn't go on, not like this. Ozzy wasn't sent just to rehab. He was sent somewhere deeper, somewhere truth couldn't hide behind fame. Behind closed doors, away from lights and crowds, he faced the ruin of the man he had become. The father his children didn't know. The husband who almost disappeared. A counselor once asked him, "What scares you most?" Ozzy didn't pause. That she'll leave, that I've broken the last piece of love I had left. But Sharon didn't leave. She walked into that place with eyes tired from years of watching him fall, but still full of fire. "You're still in there," she told him. "I haven't stopped looking." It wasn't forgiveness. It was a fight. A battle to rescue what was left before it was too late. Every day inside that facility, Ozzy fought, not for music, not for applause, but for the right to stay by the side of the woman he'd nearly lost. The war inside was brutal. He didn't walk out cured, but he walked out changed, lighter, quieter, haunted, but awake. For the first time in years, he understood the distance he'd fallen, and the miracle of still having hands to climb. Years later, he would say, "That was when it hit me. I wasn't falling anymore. I had to choose to live." After the storm, there was no peace, only a silence so dense it felt like mourning in motion. It wasn't the calm after chaos, it was the vacancy left behind. Ozzy Osbourne, stripped of the theatrics, the volume, the persona, stood alone at the edge of everything he had shattered, unsure if anything human still remained beneath the wreckage. In 1989, following a night of complete psychological collapse, a night when the woman who had once rescued him was nearly destroyed by the man he no longer recognized, Ozzy was taken not to jail, but to a psychiatric treatment center. It wasn't punishment. It was his final lifeline. Inside those sterile walls, there were no fans, no amplifiers, no escape. Only a man, consumed by guilt, sitting in the quiet echo of his own regret. For weeks, the voice that had once defined heavy metal was reduced to a whisper, barely audible even to himself. But beyond the gates, Sharon waited. She came back, not out of duty, but belief. She saw what others couldn't, a flicker of the man still trapped beneath the ruin. There was still a spark, she would later say, buried deep, but it was there. And inside that place of reckoning, Ozzy began a new kind of fight, not against the world, but against the demons that had consumed him from within. The process of detox didn't cleanse, it scorched. Every mistake, every buried trauma, every broken promise surfaced. It wasn't recovery, it was confrontation. But slowly, with the raw will of someone who had nothing left to lose, he clawed his way forward, not healed, but aware. And in 1990, he did what no one expected. He returned to music, not with the reckless power of youth, but with something sharper: perspective. Reuniting with Zakk Wylde, he began work on what would become No More Tears. Released in 1991, it wasn't just a musical success, it was a resurrection. Songs like Mama, I'm Coming Home and Road to Nowhere weren't crafted for charts. They were confessions from a soul learning how to feel again. Ozzy would later say, "That was the sound of me trying to be human." And the world listened. The very fans who had once feared they'd lost him saw a different kind of return. Not the showman, but the survivor. Still, the fight never truly stopped. Each concert was a silent triumph. Every sober sunrise, a miracle. Sharon stood by not as his savior, but as a comrade. Together, they weren't just rebuilding a marriage, they were defending it. "She didn't just save me," Ozzy confessed. "She chooses to save me every single day." Through the early 90s, he threw himself into work, touring endlessly, recording endlessly, even announcing a farewell tour in 1992, only to return again and again. Because surviving didn't mean the pain had vanished, it simply became part of the soundtrack. And when Ozzy stood beneath the lights and let his voice tear into the darkness, it wasn't for applause. It was to stay alive. Years later, looking back, he would say, "I never thought I'd live this long. Every day is borrowed, and I'm trying to make it count." For those who knew what he'd survived, the collapse, the heartbreak, the silent battles, this wasn't a comeback. It was a defiance. a man who had been to the edge of obliteration and instead of falling, found a reason to rise. The wounds remained, but he wore them not as shame, but as proof. Proof that survival is a choice. Not once, but every single day. Just when it seemed the storm had finally passed, when Ozzy Osbourne had clawed his way toward a fragile peace, stitched together with broken memories and hard-earned redemption, fate struck again. Not with scandal, not with self-destruction, but with the quiet cruelty of time. The early 2000s should have been Ozzy's golden chapter. His legacy was being rediscovered by a younger generation, and the Osbournes, a chaotic and unscripted window into his everyday life, transformed him from a metal icon into a surprisingly endearing household figure. Gone was the distant, fearsome Prince of Darkness. In his place stood a bewildered but lovable father, fumbling with remotes, mumbling through his kitchen in mismatched clothes. Premiering in 2002, the show exploded in popularity, bringing Ozzy into living rooms far removed from the thunderous riffs of Black Sabbath. But beneath the absurd domestic fame, Ozzy remained a man on the edge. Now in his 50s, he bore the cost of decades lived at full throttle. Stiff joints, slower reflexes, and a body that no longer obeyed without protest. And then, on December 8, 2003, everything changed. A routine ride on a quad bike across his estate turned catastrophic. The vehicle flipped, slamming him into the earth with bone-breaking force. His collarbone shattered, several ribs fractured, a vertebra in his neck crushed. His lungs collapsed. He stopped breathing. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, where he was placed on a ventilator, hovering in a coma for 8 long days. Silent. Still. Vulnerable in a way the world had never seen. Sharon later said, "I thought I was going to lose him. I was bracing for goodbye." Fans across the globe held their breath. After all he'd survived, could this truly be the end? But Ozzy, once again, defied fate. Against the odds, he woke up. His first whispered words felt like a miracle. Doctors warned recovery would be long and uncertain. Walking again, breathing freely, even basic movement, all would take time. But Ozzy had spent a lifetime defying limits. Through searing pain, through a brutal recovery that drained him to the core, he began the climb back. Each step was a declaration, each breath a rebellion. And just months later, in 2004, he took the stage at the Brighty Awards to a thunderous standing ovation, not just from fans, but from a world that had watched him crash and rise again and again. Yet the crash had left behind more than broken bones. Invisible scars lingered. Chronic pain haunted him daily. Some mornings, simply standing took everything he had. "I wake up and it hurts," Ozzy admitted. "But I'm still breathing. That's enough." In these later years, his strength wasn't in fire or spectacle. It wasn't in volume. It was in persistence. The roar had softened to a growl, but the fight remained. Ozzy's defiance now lived in endurance, in refusing to quit, even when everything told him to. He turned pain into poetry, struggle into song, and as he stepped, slower but unbowed, back into the light, one truth became undeniable. Some legends don't burn out. They simply refuse to fade. Just when Ozzy Osbourne believed he had endured every torment life could throw his way, when the storms seemed to have finally stilled and the scars had quietly settled into something like peace, the year 2019 arrived with a cruelty so profound it eclipsed even his darkest trials. There were no flashing lights this time, no thunderous crowds to drown out the dread, just a quiet day at home. A single misstep, and a devastating consequence. One fall, unassuming, almost ordinary, ignited a catastrophe. The very metal rods that had been surgically implanted into his spine after his near-fatal quad bike crash in 2003 were violently jolted out of place. In a heartbeat, the past returned not as memory, but as punishment, tearing through him with a vengeance that felt both ancient and personal. Ozzy would later speak about that pain in hushed tones, describing it as beyond anything I've ever felt. A haunting admission from a man who had already stared down death more times than most can count. But the fall wasn't the conclusion. It was only the prologue to a new torment. Not long after, he received a diagnosis that quietly shattered what remained of his physical certainty. Parkinson's disease. It did not arrive like a thunderclap. It crept in, silent and merciless, unraveling movement, stealing balance, and shaking the very foundation of his freedom. For Ozzy, who had once prowled the stage like a force of nature, it felt like watching his reflection blur into a stranger. The tremors began. His footing betrayed him. And then came the confession, painfully real and painfully public. I can't walk properly these days. I'm just wobbling. There was no mask to wear, no myth to hide behind, just a man, raw and revealed. That admission didn't just crack open a truth. It broke hearts. This wasn't just a diagnosis. It was a quiet war. As the world looked on, Ozzy wasn't battling spotlights or headlines anymore. He was battling time itself. These past few years have been sheer misery, he confided in his final chapter. Words so heavy, they seemed to sink into the silence between them. The pain, the fear, the surrender of control. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a man living through it all. Sharon, ever at his side, stood unshaken. But even her steadfast love couldn't halt the slow, merciless progression of the illness that reshaped the man she had fought for, bled for, loved through every chaos. And all the while, Ozzy battled not only his body, but the weight of secrecy. He had hidden the truth from fans, not to protect himself, but to protect them. He didn't want to sadden the people who had stood by him through decades of darkness. But when he spoke, finally, they didn't turn away. They reached out, with compassion, with reverence. They didn't see a fallen hero. They saw a warrior still standing. And somehow, through the tremors and the pain, Ozzy still created. In 2020, he released Ordinary Man, an album soaked in sorrow, yes, but also shimmering with defiance. It wasn't just another record. It was a lifeline, a final howl into the void, saying, I am still here. I still have something to give. Ozzy Osbourne's greatest fight was never just on stage. It was within. Every day he woke up, planted his cane to the ground, and took another step. He was defying gravity, age, and everything that once tried to bury him. Every lyric he sang through clenched teeth and aching bones was a vow. And though surgeries and hospital beds became more frequent than encores, though even he admitted there were days he wasn't sure he'd make it out of bed, one truth remained. He never surrendered. I'm not ready to hang up my mic yet, he said defiantly. And in those words lived everything: rage, hope, memory, and grit. That's what made his final years so piercingly unforgettable. Not the legacy, not the fame, but the refusal to go quiet. In the twilight of his journey, Ozzy Osbourne didn't fade. He roared. Bruised, unsteady but unbroken, he reminded the world one last time. Legends don't disappear. They echo. And even now, with the lights dimmed and the curtain drawn, that echo continues, raw, aching, and profoundly human. As the illness deepened its grip and the world grew quieter around him, life began to distill into moments, slower, smaller, but achingly more profound. The air at their countryside estate held a kind of sacred stillness, broken only by the gentle creak of floorboards or the rustle of leaves outside. Inside, it was a different rhythm now, one of quiet rituals and unspoken understandings. Sharon remained by his side, her presence as constant as breath, her fingers laced with his. Ozzy, the storm once wrapped in leather and volume, now whispered more than he spoke. Not from silence, but because his body simply couldn't match the speed of his mind. Parkinson's, cruel in its patience, continued its slow march. It stripped away autonomy with surgical precision, reducing simple acts into monumental efforts. The man who once soared across festival stages now struggled to sit without aid. On some mornings, he stared at his own hands in frustration, watching them tremble against his will. He confessed once, his voice brittle, "The past 4 years have been sheer hell for me. My health has been in a terrible state." But even as his body surrendered inch by inch, his essence held fast. His thoughts remained electric. His humor, timed like a drum hit, never left. And his eyes still sparked with that untamable mischief that had once made millions scream. "This body's broken," he joked with a tired grin, "but the brain's still partying." Their days became slow conversations and long silences steeped in memory. He'd ask for tea every morning, never sedatives, never distraction. Just tea and Sharon. Together, they wandered through time. He'd drift back to Aston, the soot-streaked walls, the hunger, the fights. He laughed at his first performance, all nerves and chaos. He spoke of Tony, Geezer, and Bill. Not as legends, but as friends who'd once helped him give shape to a sound the world had never heard before. And then, quieter, he'd talk of his children. Kelly's fire, Jack's steadiness, Amy's quiet wisdom, and the grandkids, each one a miracle in motion. "Promise me," he murmured to Sharon one evening, the light fading across his face. "They'll remember the fire, not the flicker." Sharon, holding back tears, nodded. She had weathered everything with him: chaos, collapse, revival. But this was different. His body was dimming, but the soul inside still roared. As the summer days shortened, a new gravity settled into the rhythm of the house. Each morning felt more delicate. Each night, a little longer. The days crept toward twilight, each one more fragile than the last, until they finally arrived at the edge of goodbye. Then came the moment she would never forget. It was late June 2025. They sat by the window as dusk settled over the estate. The sky glowed orange. Ozzy stared straight ahead, eyes clearer than they had been in weeks. He turned slowly to her and whispered, "I don't want them to remember a man in a wheelchair. I don't want to be their sadness. I want to give them one last roar." Where it all began. It wasn't just a request, it was a plea. A vow, a final act of rebellion from a man who had spent his life defying gravity. Sharon didn't cry. Not then. She simply nodded. She had one job now, to turn that dying wish into something immortal. The next morning, she started making calls. Quiet ones, strategic ones. Ozzy could barely stand, let alone tour. But maybe, just maybe, for one night, in one place, she could give him back his fire. Could a broken body still command a stage? Could the Prince of Darkness rise again, one final time? She didn't know, but she was going to find out. Because behind the failing body was still Ozzy, still fire, still thunder, and his final dream was now hers to carry. And then, as if the universe had heard his final wish, not for more time, not for less pain, but simply to ignite the stage once more before the darkness closed in. Sharon made that dream real. The sky over Villa Park burned with the colors of dusk, but it wasn't the sunset that drew breathless silence from the 40,000 gathered souls. It was what they were about to witness. July 5th, 2025, wasn't just another night in Birmingham. It was something sacred, a farewell wrapped in chords and memory, a homecoming decades in the making. Ozzy Osbourne, the boy who once wandered Aston's soot-stained streets with nothing but hunger in his pocket and noise in his soul, was coming home, not to be buried, but to burn one last time. Backstage, the energy was not one of chaos, but of reverence. The crew moved carefully. Sharon stood nearby, watching as the love of her life was gently helped into the seat that would carry him to his altar. Dressed in all black, hair brushed neatly back, his frame looked small, but his presence filled the space. And then, the gates opened. The crowd roared, not the roar of frenzy, but of grief, of awe, of farewell. A black steel throne rolled onto the stage, and there he was. Not a shadow, not a memory. Ozzy. The music began, and with the first trembling line of, "Mama, I'm coming home," it became clear. This was not a concert. It was communion. Fans clutched their hearts. Grown men wept without shame. Children stared in silent wonder. It was his voice, worn but unmistakable, that cut through the night like a final heartbeat. And when he reached the chorus, even the heavens seemed to listen. The stage was filled with legends: Iommi, Butler, Ward. They had returned, not just as bandmates, but as brothers. This was the original Sabbath, the beginning and the end, folding into one. Crazy Train thundered through the speakers like a time machine, ripping open decades of history in seconds. Ozzy didn't move much. He didn't have to. A raised hand, a single grin. Those were the explosions now. Fireworks shot into the sky, not to dazzle, but to salute. And in one quiet moment, as the final chords faded, and the audience stood frozen in reverent disbelief, Ozzy leaned toward the mic and whispered words no one would ever forget. "I was never supposed to make it this far, but you brought me here." No curtain call, no encore, just the lights dimming slowly and a city exhaling all at once. Behind the stage, Sharon met him with tears and trembling hands. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything. "I did it. We did it." And somewhere in the night, beyond the banners, beyond the headlines, beyond the pain, Birmingham held its breath and let him go. Not in silence, but in song. Because that night wasn't an ending. It was a benediction. A final roar for the man who taught the world how to scream. 17 days after his final thunderous performance in Birmingham, Ozzy Osbourne drew his final breath, not under the spotlight, but in the peaceful stillness of his own home, surrounded by the people who loved him most. In the final dusk of Ozzy Osbourne's extraordinary journey, as the stage lights faded and the voice that once shook arenas softened into a faint, weary whisper, the world bore witness to a transformation more profound than any encore. These were not simply the last years of a rock star. They were the intimate, agonizing chapters of a man who had given every piece of himself to music, to mayhem, and to those who saw themselves in his glorious wreckage. By the time he entered his 70s, Ozzy's body was no longer an instrument. It had become a battleground. Though diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 2003, he kept it hidden until 2020, weathering the torment quietly as the illness carved its path through him. He endured endless spinal surgeries, relentless nerve pain, and backstage collapses that would have broken most men. But Ozzy kept showing up, not for obligation, but for something purer, a sense of sacred debt to the fans who stood by him through every descent, every climb, every resurrection. His last act of rebellion didn't unfold in a stadium's thunder. It unfolded in the fragile stillness of vulnerability. During his final creative stretch, Ozzy recorded Patient Number 9, an album not born of ambition but of desperation. A last confession pressed into sound. Each lyric bled like a goodbye. Each riff was a defiant heartbeat against the looming silence. "I'm not afraid to die," he once admitted. "I'm more afraid of not being remembered." The recording sessions were grueling. He sang sitting down, gripping the mic stand like a tether to life itself. Producers spoke of moments when he could barely complete a take without tears. But still, he sang. Still, he gave. Because for Ozzy, music was never a job. It was an exorcism of everything dark, wild, and utterly human. Behind closed doors, the battle turned even more brutal. Sharon recalled how he often described himself as a ghost within his own body, watching the world spin while he remained frozen. But every morning, he clawed toward purpose, drawn forward by a memory, a melody, or simply the laughter of his children echoing through the hall. He never sugarcoated his past. In his final interviews, he laid it bare. The addictions, the failures, the father he wished he'd been. "I wasn't always good," he confessed, "but I always tried to come back better." And he did, again and again, until his body could no longer carry the flame his soul still fanned. As his time grew short and hospital visits multiplied, his family became his anchor. Jack, Kelly, and Amy read him fan letters filled with stories of survival and gratitude. Sharon never left his side, her voice the last thing he heard every night, whispering truths that belonged to just the two of them. And then, silence. A kind of silence that no stage could hold. A silence vast, sacred, and final. When Ozzy Osbourne passed, the world didn't just lose a musician. It lost a force of nature, a defiant fire that had burned through generations, lighting the way for misfits, rebels, and the broken-hearted. His agony became our anthem, his chaos our clarity. He may have died in silence, but the echo of his life is eternal. In every searing guitar solo, in every outsider who finds themselves in a guttural lyric, in every soul who dares to rise one more time, Ozzy lives on. That is his legacy. That is the immortal roar of a spirit that refused to be silenced. The funeral is over. The music has stopped. The flowers are wilting. And now, the silence has begun. For Sharon Osbourne, this is the cruelest chapter yet. Not the chaos of hospitals, not the weight of knowing what was coming, but this, the stillness, the unbearable quiet of a home that no longer breathes with him, the bed that stays cold on one side, the chair that no longer rocks, the voice that once called her name in the middle of the night, gone, and in its place, a silence that howls. The world saw the tribute. They watched the crowds. They posted the photos. But what they didn't see, and what they never will, is Sharon walking through the hallway with his slippers still untouched. Her brushing a jacket that still smells like him. Her breaking down in the kitchen because she reached for a second cup of tea out of habit. This isn't cinematic grief. This is the kind that lives in bone. The kind that doesn't scream. It just lingers. And yet, she endures. She wakes up every morning in a world that no longer makes sense, and she continues. Not because she knows how, but because she must. She carries the unbearable, for her children, for his memory, for the millions who never knew Ozzy personally, but loved him like family. And though her heart is shattered, she holds the pieces close, because that, too, is love. What remains now is not performance, it is preservation. Ozzy is gone, but what he meant, what he gave, what he represented, still needs tending. And no one is more equipped than Sharon to do that. Not as a producer, not as a celebrity, but as the one who knew him when the lights were off, when the crowds had left, when the madness had quieted. She was his home, and now she is his legacy's guardian. In these days of mourning, words often fail. But if you feel this loss, if Ozzy's voice ever gave you courage, comfort, or company in your loneliest hour, this is your moment. Share it, speak it, say his name in the comment below. Tell Sharon, tell the family, tell the world. He mattered. He still matters. Because while Ozzy Osbourne's voice may have gone quiet, his echo lives in us, in every lyric that saved us, in every memory that shaped us, in every ache that now feels a little heavier without him. And as Sharon sits beneath a sky he no longer sees, she is not asking for pity, only presence. Be here. Mourn with her. Honor him. Keep the light on.